Hey guys, Mr. Bostic here. Welcome back to Ancient History. It's time for us to go ahead and get started with part 4 of our review of Chapter 7, this time on philosophy, economy, and social structure. But as you can imagine, philosophy is going to take up most of our time because it involves just a little bit more complicated material. And just, just so we keep this straight, we already dealt with the early philosophers, the pre-Socratic philosophers, meaning before Socrates. This time we get to deal with the full flowering, really, of classical Greek philosophy, and it really expands at this point. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right. Now, first and foremost, guys, we need to keep in mind who we're dealing with here, and in this order, because each one of these gentlemen was the teacher of the next. Right? Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, and the most famous student of Aristotle was Alexander the Great. Um, but but more on that later. All right, so let's keep in mind what's going on with these philosophers and why they really are much more profound, and why these days, if you say philosophy, you mean something much closer to what they were pursuing than to what the early or pre-Socratic philosophers were pursuing, because they were really dealing with truth in a much broader way, much beyond the physical. I mean, for example, truth, beauty, love, virtue. You can't measure those things. You can't try to determine, if those things came from one particular element or not. I mean, these are things that are much broader and much, that underlay everything about human life. And so we were dealing with something on a much bigger scale. Furthermore, they combated the sophists, those who, basically wisdom merchants, who were really just trying to train people to pursue what they called wisdom, but it was really just influence and the knowledge of rhetoric to be able to influence their fellow citizens in the assembly. And so, that's all well and good. These great thinkers were going much further than that. Right? We have some famous quotes, from them here, and for example, Socrates is famous for saying that the wise man is he who knows that he knows nothing, which seems like a contradiction of terms, but you know, but it's actually profound. Someone who knows enough that they realize that what little they know is really nothing compared to all there is to know. Plato, likewise, famous for his exploration of the concept that he popularized, this idea of the realm of the forms, and we'll talk about that more later. And really, for Aristotle, almost every field, he became what was later acknowledged to be the expert in. Right. So let's go ahead and jump in. And since they're so chronological, of course, we'll begin with Socrates. Right. Now, another famous quote from Socrates, and there are plenty, is that the unexamined life is not worth living. Right. And what does he mean by that? Well, he means that if you simply live your life acting or reacting to stimuli or things going on around you, then you're not truly behaving fully in a human way. This is the way that animals live, but that humans live at a more profound level and ought to reflect that in their actions and therefore live in a way that shows that they've been examining or reflecting upon the nature of what it means to be human as beyond simply the animal component of our being, right? His method that he was very, very famous for is questioning. That he didn't simply propound, offer ideas and sort of lecture upon them. He would ask questions of those he was talking with, and when they would answer, he would examine those questions and sort of dig underneath them, and it almost always sort of demolishing what the first impressions or the glib answers he would get to begin with, and digging deeper and deeper, looking for the truth. And he was a big supporter of what's called the Apollonian dictum, or the teaching of Delphi, which is to know thyself. This was famously inscribed on Apollo's temple in Delphi. Right? And so really trying to like I keep saying, dig beneath the surface, beneath appearances, and to try to get at the truth that underlies so much of the daily life that goes so often unnoticed or unexamined. Right? He believed that conscience was a better guide to action than law, meaning just because something's legal doesn't necessarily mean it's virtuous, or conversely, sometimes just because something's illegal doesn't necessarily mean that it's not virtuous, right? Any kind of idea of conscientious objection against laws or the desire to better laws ultimately has its roots back to Socrates, right? The idea that it's better to suffer evil than to commit evil. I mean, this flies in the face of what most people tend to think, right? They want to avoid suffering any evil, and all too often, when we look at crime rates, they're ready to commit evil rather than suffer it. But from the point of view of the soul, and keep in mind, this is centuries before Christ, but he very much believed in the soul. The idea that that man is both soul and body, and he saw the soul as the more permanent, the more profound part of the human being, and that to commit evil is to damage your own soul, right? So there's early Christians saw a lot of parallels, not everything, absolutely, but a lot of parallels between Socrates and Plato and to some degree Aristotle in their philosophical teachings, as in comparison with the Christian moral teachings that come from Christ and from the Jewish tradition. All right, now, interesting things about him. He didn't charge his students. However, a lot of famous Athenians, including Alcibiades, and we'll read about him later, were friends and pupils of Socrates. In the end, however, because he was so good at sort of demolishing people's presuppositions or their own kind of puffed up idea of themselves, he ended up being wrongly accused and sentenced to death. And take a look, with what he was accused for. The book covers some of these. One was sophistry, which is ironic because he was very anti-sophist, and another is undermining belief in the gods. Now, this is a bit of a trumped-up charge because by this time in Athens, most Athenians, most Greeks at this time period, sort of gave lip service to the gods, and they used them as sort of part of the way they described reality, but they didn't really have a very profound belief, many people, in the gods. And so to charge someone in this way was pretty insincere. And then the last one, corrupting the youth. In other words, teaching their children or undermining the kind of worldly values that people were trying to teach their children through his own teachings. Right? And in the end, he was sentenced to death, and he complied with it. He volunteered to drink the hemlock, meaning it's a type of poison, and did so, in prison, and sat there talking to his friends until it took effect. There's a very famous scene described in a dialogue by Plato. We'll get to that. But and depicted here in this piece of art for us, in fact, by a much later French artist. But the whole concept being that his entire life was geared towards truth, and he wanted to pursue that truth until the moment of death, even after having been convicted unjustly. Right? Now, interestingly enough, he's one of the great philosophers and really the creator of this whole expansive, much more profound school of philosophy, but didn't leave any writings. And so how do we know anything about it? Well, mostly through Plato. And this is one of the interesting things. It can be sometimes a little difficult, confusing ideas between Socrates and Plato, because most of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato. Right? So at this point, let's move to his most famous student and talk about some of Plato's ideas. All right. Now, one of the key ideas of Plato, and this is a little hard to grasp, well, it can be, is that ideas, and he called them the forms, and that anything has both, matter, meaning the stuff it's made out of, and the form, meaning the idea behind how it's made and what its purpose is, right? So the forms are more real than the things, than actual things. And that may sound strange that ideas would be more real than things, but imagine if you have a chair, right? You could destroy that chair, but what you haven't destroyed is the quality of, and it sounds a little silly to say it, but chairness, right? You haven't done anything to eliminate this concept of having a thing to sit down upon. And you can find all kinds of chairs that look quite different from each other, are made out of different types of matter or material, but they all recognize this kind of universal concept of chairness. And we don't think in these terms typically these days, and it might sound a little strange, but the concept is that this idea of the necessity of having a type of thing on which to sit is so universal that you can't destroy it. It's more foundational, it's more real even than any particular individual chair is. Right. Now, Plato wrote, well, all the writings of Plato that we have are his dialogues, and that makes Plato in many ways a lot more approachable than some of well, for Socrates left no writings, and we learn about Socrates through Plato. And the forms of writing that Aristotle left or that we have rather, are mostly based on notes. It's not like just reading notes, but it's much more condensed. It wasn't. Aristotle also wrote dialogues, but we don't have any of them. So reading Plato is a lot more. It's a little bit more like reading a play or reading a novel, and reading Aristotle is a lot more dense, right? So one of the most there are many of these dialogues, but the most famous and the most lengthy is the Republic, and it all centers around the whole concept of what is the ideal state, and it begins with Socrates walking along with friends as usual, talking about key ideas, and asking the first question, what is justice? And a lot of people offer ideas, and he mostly kind of demolishes them, and then they arrive at this concept that justice is giving to each person what that person is due, whether it's reward or punishment, based on their actions. Right? So they're kind of digging down and getting to essential concepts, and it's a very long. It's really the foundation of all Western politics, frankly. It is that dialogue kind of exploring what is the ideal state, and in many ways, he doesn't actually arrive at any single answer. In fact, they arrive at some conclusions multiple times throughout the dialogue, and they don't like those, so they scrap those and they come back to them. It's all depicted as a conversation, and in many ways, of course, political ideas have been a conversation down through the centuries about what is best. Right? This is just to kind of give you an illustration of what the nature of those dialogues is like. Right? Plato very famously sought after truth, goodness, and beauty, right? But especially for him in the realm of the forms, as we mentioned before, this concept always of matter versus form, and that's a foundational idea for him. Now, skipping out just a little bit, one of the key concepts that comes up in the Republic is the allegory of the cave, and the book, I believe, mentions that, but doesn't really explain it. Let me try to explain it very quickly. His concept was that essentially everyone living in society, just kind of caught up in their daily lives, really from our birth until something breaks us out of it. We're essentially like people who were born and raised in a cave, and all they know, in fact, you can see in this artistic depiction here, they have, they're sitting here turned away from any source of natural true light, and in between them, and with their backs up against the wall, in fact, chained there. And the only kind of light they have is this artificial light, this fire. And the only things they perceive are images cast against the wall of the cave that are being manipulated here. They're being kind of presented to them by people who have the opportunity to present images to them, just in shadowy form. So they see not only not real things, but they see shadows of false things with false light. And most of them don't have any realization that it's not full reality. Right? And so the philosopher is one who realizes the difficulty, frees himself, and finds his way out to the true light of the outside world, the true, unaffected, uncontorted, unmanipulated reality. But doesn't stop there, but who goes back and helps free others and helps convince them to shed the illusions. Notice these illusions of reality, and pursue reality as it truly is, leaving the cave, right? And so not only for himself but for others, is helping to free them from the perceptions that the world or that life or that perspective can impose upon us, and help them kind of escape into the full light of day, light being reason and inspiration. And it's a powerful image, and it's been it's one of the most famous images that comes out of the Republic, which is, one of the many, but one of the most important. All right. He founded the first academy. In fact, anything named academy is being named after Plato's school. And it lasted for 1,000 years until it was closed by the Emperor Justinian. Right? This is sort of shocking to the modern reader, but he distrusted democracy because he called it the tyranny of the majority. And if you look at places, for example, like um, we could take our own country. If we look at the way that some, that minority races were treated, particularly the black people were treated, especially before the Civil War, or even up through before the Civil Rights Movement. This is a case where the majority were able, through democracy, to mistreat, to institutionalize injustice. And so, I mean, it's not hard to find places where democracy definitely doesn't do something virtuous, and that shocks the modern thinker. We tend to equate democracy with the best of everything, and there are many times where just because something's good doesn't mean that everybody necessarily is going to support it, right? And so you don't always have virtue coming out of democracy, and it's something that the ancients were quite aware of. In this first democracy of Athens, it's something that was pretty obvious, in fact, to thinking people living at the time, right? He suggested that he thought the best ruler would be a philosopher king. In other words, a king who's been raised to be a philosopher and to have rejected, as we see here with Plato, all the illusions, and been trained in to live an austere life himself from a very young age, and then is in a better position to be dispassionate and to rule without ruling for himself, but to rule for the best of all. Right? Now, as mentioned before, it's difficult to separate Plato and his ideas from Socrates, but largely because we know most of what we do about Socrates through those dialogues of Plato, especially in terms of in-depth ideas. We do have other documents that deal with his life, and famously, we know he's not a fictional character. But it can be hard to separate the two, the teacher from the student. Right? Now, in terms of Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, it's time for us to move on to discuss some of his ideas. Now, here, once again, one of the many famous comments from Aristotle, man is a political animal, and this is the foundation of his concept in the politics. Right now, among many things, as mentioned a little bit further down here, he became the authority in a vast array, really almost every array, and that's it in that day. Oops, sorry about that, guys. Yeah, he became the authority in, he wrote the politics, his poetics, his physics. He coined the term metaphysics, meaning an in-depth study of reality and wisdom about things that are beyond the physics, right? It means next to. That's what metaphysics means. But it's essentially most of what people would call philosophy today. But on top of that, he was very interested in biology. He wrote the masterful work, the Nicomachean Ethics, and he really did everything, right? Now, Aristotle was born in Macedonia, and later, in fact, as we mentioned, became tutor to Prince Alexander. But at age 17, he came to Athens and became the most famous student of Plato, and eventually founded his own school, the Lyceum. Now, this is also a term, like academy, that's used many, many times for institutions of learning or at least cultural study, long past ancient Athens. In fact, there's many of the great cities, or even not huge cities in America, have some kind of institution named the Lyceum. It's the origin of the word in Italian and French for what they call high school, lycée in French, or liceo in Italian. And so it's also a profound academic foundational word, right? It's often called the peripatetic. His was often called the peripatetic school, just because he would often walk around talking with his students. And that's what it means. They would walk together and talk about things. And of course, we see in Plato's dialogue Socrates doing that as well. Right? Now, he distinguished something, and this is really foundational, two different methods of reasoning. And that all reasoning is either inductive, meaning that it goes from observation of the world to forming principles from that. For example, if I keep letting go of something and I keep seeing it fall, then I can learn the principle that if I let something go, it will fall. And that sounds really basic, but a lot of human reasoning and human knowledge is based on making observations and learning a lesson from that, and that's inductive reasoning, right? It's in fact the basis of the scientific method. And Aristotle was a much more, in that sense, scientific, sort of methodical, experiential-based thinker himself, right? Versus deductive reasoning, meaning I have some principles and I can work from those principles. In other words, once I've dropped the thing enough times and realized if I let go, it falls, then I know what's going to happen. I can think, oh, well, if I'm going to let go of this thing, I know what will happen to it. It will fall. That's deductive reasoning. It's working from the principle of gravity. They didn't call it gravity yet, but nonetheless, the principle of gravity to the observation of what will occur as a natural consequence. All right. Another key idea of Aristotle's is that virtue, rather than just being the opposite of a vice, that it's actually the mean, the average, in between two extremes or two vices. For example, courage, the most important virtue for a soldier, isn't just the opposite of cowardice. It's the opposite also in a sense of rashness, of being so courageous that you're foolhardy, right? So a coward has too little courage, and a rash person, in a sense, has too much of it, right? And does things beyond what he's capable of controlling, or it's in a sense irresponsibly, right? Through an excess of courage and not having enough common sense. So this is it's a new concept, and it's true of really the active virtues, right? He, Aristotle, as a student, he had great respect for Plato, but he differs from him on a number of key ideas, namely the forms, among others. And in many ways, he's much more of an experimental realist and less sort of a detached idealist. I mean, obviously, someone like Plato, thinking about the forms as more real than things, is really emphasizing the ideal. And Aristotle is more kind of 2 feet on the ground and less given to sort of full-scale investing in ideals only. As we mentioned before, Aristotle became the tutor of Alexander the Great, and trained him as a philosopher king. And in many ways, Alexander attempted that mode, although he was primarily a conqueror and died so young that he didn't really get a chance to, or at least give himself a chance to, establish peaceful reign in a stable way, right? But Alexander was so influenced by his tutor that one of the few things he took with him on his conquest personally, in terms of personal goods, was his copy of Homer and the one that had been annotated for him by Aristotle, Aristotle's comments in the margins, right? And he took scholars with him. He took all kinds of people kind of following with him in the train of his conquest, and established all kinds of great cities and centers of learning. But along the way, and in this swift conquest, but it says something that this is the emphasis he gave in the sense of learning. He had a high regard for Aristotle, and from the Middle Ages, for a while, Aristotle had been lost in Western Europe, but once he had been regained, he was such the authority in almost every area that people would distrust their own findings if it seemed to disagree with Aristotle, which is made a big deal of in a lot of. If you look at the early parts of science textbooks, they tend to sort of dismiss Aristotle because of that sort of authoritative influence. And modern science has tended to want to break away from authorities and move to new discoveries, etc. But his influence, both through the scientific method with inductive reasoning and through his own science, though it wasn't perfect. Remember, he didn't have microscopes or telescopes, and so much of modern science is based on being able to see beyond what the human eye can see, right? But nonetheless, his reasoning is really profound, right? A key idea we see up here at the top right is this is the kind of way his mind would work, right? The first question he starts with in this concept of politics is, who ought to rule, right? And there can be really only 3 answers to that. Either that one person should rule, that only a few people should have the power and rule, or that generally many to most people should rule, right? But then the question becomes, well, in what way are they going to rule? Are they going to rule a virtuous way, right? Or are they going to, in other words, for their own interests, not for their own interests, but for the common interest, or are they going to rule in despotic, kind of selfish interest, a tyranny, right, as we call it? But and he distinguishes the kinds of government based on that, right? One ruler who's ruling for the common interest he calls a monarch. but a single person ruling for his own despotic interest, he calls a tyrant. Right? But a few people ruling, but for the common interest, he accords the title aristocracy, which comes from the Greek and means the rule of the best people. The same situation where those people are ruling for their own selfish interest, he calls an oligarchy. Right? If you have the many ruling for the common interest, he could notice he doesn't call that a democracy. He calls it a polity. When he the word democracy he applies to many people ruling, but for their own interests, for their own kind of private gain, instead of the true good of all. And once again, it's a key thing that it's important in our day and age when so much rides on this to understand that these terms we can use, like democracy, are not always reflective of the perfect kind of ideals that we tend to think of them as being. All right, now, guys, that includes a lot, of course, that the book talked about, and it adds things to them. It's a lot of content. I understand that. Please feel free to go back and look at that later. At this point, we need to move on to, really, in many ways, the simpler parts toward the end of this section. So let's jump ahead. All right. Now, at this point, we're dealing really with two halves. It's economy and social structure, but the first half of that really is public life, right? The economy, right? Slaves and resident aliens in terms of the structure of society, taxation, how that works, right? So with the economy, keep in mind, of course, as we mentioned before, most of their economy is agriculture. I mean, especially if you're talking about Athens, olive oil, wine. I mean, that's true largely across Greece. Not many areas, as we've said, could produce enough wheat to produce lots of other kinds of agricultural products. They did have lots of fruit orchards and olive orchards, but excuse me, a lot of agricultural products. They raised animals, but that was largely for themselves as opposed to export. It's olive oil and wine that they exported, and a few manufactured products like pottery that became important, and you saw even at the time of the Trojan War had been important. Now, keep in mind that means that they're making a lot of things, but they're going to rely on two things. One, importing grain and other key aspects, as well as luxury goods, right? And this is especially true with Athens. And it comes to bear a lot on the future of Athens, because it means if they have to import food to survive, all someone has to do to beat them in war is take away their food by blockading their supply of food. And that's exactly what happens in the war coming up. The situation also means that the Greeks and Athenians in particular are depending on merchants, buying, selling, and trading, and shipping, shipping the things that they can make in abundance, like olive oil and wine, and bringing into them the goods that they need. Right now, factories at this point tended to be small, basically, workshops usually behind the store where they're selling those goods, and that's especially pottery, but also leather goods, cloth, other relatively, as well as more specialty goods like jewelry, etc. But by and large, you're talking small scale, nothing like modern factories, right? Now, in the social structure, who's doing that work? Well, it's mostly not citizens. I mean, you have poor citizens, that's true, but a lot of the work, especially the heavy work, and even a lot of the craft work, is done by slaves or resident aliens. I mean, the people who are not Athenian citizens, they and their families for generations might actually have lived in these Greek cities, but they weren't accorded the rights of citizenship because that's not where they came from. A slave sometimes was allowed to earn money if they did work outside of the work done for their owner, and they sometimes could earn enough money to buy their own freedom. But by doing so, they didn't become a citizen; they became a resident alien, right? And so they had certain minimal privileges, but they didn't have the rights of citizenship. I mean, giving over citizenship in ancient Greece was a very, very high and a rare honor, and usually only for really great, important service to the state. Right? They still had to pay taxes, they still had to give military service, but they weren't citizens. Right? Now, about taxes, the wealthy, and this is back from the time of Pisistratus, the wealthy paid higher taxes, and sometimes kind of burdensome taxes, but in some ways it was a competition. Right? They would compete for the fame of having done something well, right? Like whether they contributed a chorus for a play or they equipped a warship. Right? Now, one thing we should keep in mind is that because of the Delian League and the tributes coming in from so many city-states, to the Delian League when Athens was building its empire, a lot of the tax burden of kind of building themselves in a great style was taken up by those Delian tribute payments coming from other city states, and so a lot of the taxation for them was defrayed. But the wealthy would kind of go out of their way to make a name for themselves by publicly doing things that would help the polis, right? Bit like wealthy patrons today who would donate a few $1 million, but have their name placed on the building that it helps to build, or on some kind of event that's named in their honor. It's a bit of sort of civic showmanship. Now, contrasted to public life, you have private life. Now, in families, keep in mind, there's quite a distinction, even from earlier Greek times. I mean, well, men, and by that they really mean sort of wealthier men, especially Greek Athenian citizens, for example, and it's true in most city-states. They spend a lot of their time in the agora, in athletic competitions, and in the agora, meeting, gathering, buying things, talking with people, political life. You keep in mind, and this is democracy, and they're all essentially the equivalent of congressmen, right? Married women, however, and this meaning sort of honorable women, were very sheltered. Right? They lived at home. They left, and they say they left mostly for weddings, funerals, and religious ceremonies. That means, generally speaking, they need to leave with chaperones, and if they're not being chaperoned, that's when the problem comes around, because an unchaperoned woman in public was assumed to be either of low class or of questionable morals, let's say. Right? Now, that's mostly true for the rich and the sort of honorable aspects of society. The poor didn't really have that kind of luxury, and the poor women, or people who were in trades that indicated they had questionable morals, were out and about all around. But it was just assumed that a woman out and about, not being chaperoned by a brother or a husband or a father, was of a questionable sort, let's say. Right now, in terms of education, there was no, of course, free, public, and compulsory education has only existed for a few hundred years at all, right? So they certainly didn't have that. But the education they did have, and they did have a strong tradition of education we've already been looking at, right? It had one main goal, and that was rhetoric. It was the ability to persuade your fellow citizens in the assembly, right? And this is how sophists could make such money, promising wisdom, right, for a fee, right? Come learn from us and learn all the secrets to influencing people and becoming a great man of the city, right? Now, they also emphasize the need, in fact, for gymnastics. That this concept, and the quote here, "healthy mind and a healthy body," is famously put forth by the Romans, but it's also true with the Greeks. This idea that you needed the balance of body and mind, and both in health and in harmony together. Now, it's really boys primarily that we're talking about being educated, and the ones in wealthy families would have a pedagogos. This is where we get the term pedagogy, meaning education, right? But that term meant a tutor, and generally these tutors were slaves. Slaves that were captured from someplace, but educated men, and so they'd have a slave tutor as well as attending some sort of school. Girls, typically, not always, but typically, they would be just educated at home, and for household purposes, right? To maintain a household, to be the master of the family's kind of domestic life, and to care for children, right? Now, about the domestic life, the houses. Now, unlike our houses or large mansions or small homes, they tended to have very few outside windows. They had a door to the street, and from the front, nothing was very visible. This is to avoid theft. Right? They didn't have windows that were covered with glass. That was a very expensive thing in the ancient world. So what they did have was a big plain wall and a door leading in, but they had an inner courtyard and balconies or passageways or open doorways into that courtyard, right, toward the rear of the house. Right, light would come from there. The only other light there, of course, they have is oil lamps. Right, they'd get their water from outside the house. Nobody had running water in Greece. The Romans developed that later on, but the ancient Greeks didn't have that. So, most homes were very plain on the front, and most homes in general were quite simple. And people generally spent their life, at least the men, out and about in public, unless it was, the weather or the nighttime prevented that. So, all right, guys, I think this wraps up our time. It's been a little bit longer. Sorry about that. I'll try to be keeping them shorter as we go on, but the philosophy is pretty important, and we needed to cover those details. All right. Hope everyone's still well, and we will be building towards the end of the chapter soon. Take care, and I will talk to you later.